Alright, good afternoon everyone. My name is Utsav and today I'll be presenting on the first battle of the Marne during World War I. So today's objectives, we just want to learn what's the background of World War I, where are we at, why is this battle taking place, why did the enemy and the antagonists choose to go to war, what was the significance, the aftermath, and then how can we tie in class concepts, the Marine Corps doctrine principles, and the overall Max Boots themes from the book that we've been reading. So just to recap, Max Boots' 5 themes from over the course of the semester. Technology alone does not always provide a military edge. Tactics, organization, training, leadership, and an effective bureaucracy allow revolutions to take place. Countries that take advantage of changes win, countries that don't lose. Even if a country knows how to harness military power, it must effectively employ it. The best strategies, tactics, and technology do not provide an edge forever, and innovations have increased more rapidly. And over the course of the presentation, we'll be going through these different themes and how the French and British employed these, and how Germany did not. So the background of World War I, it started in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and World War I had begun about a month before the First Battle of the Marne. And a lot of the reasons behind the World War I include political reasonings, secret alliances, imperialism, and nationalistic pride. And the idea was that Germany essentially wanted to increase their political and economic maneuver and essentially gain more power within the coast of Europe in order to just have more strategy. And the speed of the German attack was in order to capture more parts of Europe, was part of a war strategy called the Schlieffen Plan. Germany hoped to conquer France and Western Europe before the Russians could muster their army and attack from the east. That's why they created a two-front war, which we'll be seeing later in the presentation. So who was involved? So in the overarching categories, there's the Allied powers and Central powers, and the Allied powers consisted of British, French, amongst other countries. And in this war, we see France as the main component of the Allied powers, supported by the British Expeditionary Force. So the French army was led by Joseph Simon Gallieni, had 64 divisions, and in total lost about 250,000 people, or had 250,000 casualties. And the British Expeditionary Force was the supporting role for the French army. And they were led by Sir John French. They had 6 divisions and about 13,000 casualties. And on the opposing side, in order to stop Germany, we have the German army, which is led by von Moltke Jr., not Helmuth von Moltke Sr., which was discussed during classes, leader of the Prussian-German army during the Industrial Revolution period. They had about 51 divisions, 900,000 troops in strength, and about 250,000 casualties. So overall, this war was quite large and was one of the most massive losses across World War I. So what was being fought over? So it's pretty debated as to why Germany even entered World War I. And as discussed before, it was due mostly to political and economic reasonings for just taking control all over Europe and having a much larger influence. So Germany, in order to do that, Germany posed the question, how do we deal with Russians from the east who are coming in, also part of the Allied powers, and how do we deal with France and Britain from the Western Front? And additionally, France was also wanting to take back some of the territory that Germany had gained, because a lot of minerals and resources had been taken over by Germany, located in northern France, close to the Belgium side. And essentially, the battle just consisted of Germany kind of taking a loop through Belgium into northern France, and it culminated to German advancement and pursuit of the Allied armies. So the First Battle of the Marne was fought in the north and east of Paris from September 6th to 12th, 1914. Although the dates are arguably variable. Some say it started on the 5th, some say it started on the 7th. There's no real reason of the difference, just there was no logistics back then, or not as well. But on September 6th, they were alerted by French air reconnaissance and radar intercepts. The French army slammed into von Kluck's overextended army. And on September 10th, the Germans embarked on a retreat, which ended close to the Aisne River, which is over by the Belgian front on northern France. Beginning forming a phase of the war that would be masked by trench warfare. So essentially, French pushed Germany back, as we'll see later in the presentation, into forming a longer trench across Belgium and northern France, nearly stretching to the Baltic Sea, that held them in isolation for the next 4 years of the war. And next we'll be looking at troop movement and how Germans attacked from their side, and how France and the British Expeditionary Force countered them, and how the Russians eventually came in from the east.
So, ever since the Franco-Prussian War in early 1870s, Germany recognized that they were probably going to face another war with France. And that Franco-Prussian War was the war that allowed Germany to unify. And they, at that time, defeated France. So they were able to capture some very valuable territory from France, which was very mineral rich, including the places Alsace and Lorraine. And so the Germans were plotting to plotting to fight France again in case there was another chance. And this kind of leads into the overall World War I. Why did Germany even enter the war? Well, a lot of it was for political, economic reasons, wanting to expand their territory and political influence. But at the same time, though, once France and Russia had this alliance, Germany kind of recognized that if they were going to have another war with France, which they did, it's likely to not just be with France. It's probably going to be a two-front war, Western and Eastern Front. So on the Western Front, they'll probably be in conflict with France, and on the Eastern Front, they would be in conflict with Russia. And so to deal with this eventually, they came up with the Schlieffen Plan. And it was named after Alfred von Schlieffen, who was the chief of the German Empire's general staff from 1891 to 1905. And it was totally based on how do you deal with a two-front war. And the general idea was that Russia had a large and almost inexhaustible army, but because it was so large, it would take a long time for it to mobilize. And the Germans were actually able to approximate it correctly at how long it would take for them to actually come through, and for them to be able to fight off the Russians at the beginning of World War I. And they figured that by the time Russia would actually be able to get up and going by itself, it would take about 6 weeks. So this newfound Schlieffen Plan then called for enough German troops on the Eastern Front just to keep the Russians at bay. But the main fighting force of the Germans, the main effort that combined Germany used their combined arms while the Russians were mobilizing in that 6 weeks to go after France and essentially just knock them out of the park, so that they're not facing a two-front war anymore. And then the idea was that they would have those troops go back to fight against the Russians once Russia actually came to the picture. And the way they wanted to do it was just by rolling right through Belgium in a wheel-like pattern, kind of like this, just how I'm drawing it. And the reason they wanted to do this wheel-like pattern was that they correctly predicted that the French were very eager to get some of the territory closer to the edge of France and Belgium. And French actually had a plan for this. They called it Plan 17, to take back Alsace and Lorraine and get back those minerals that originally Germany had conquered. So this was strictly an offensive plan. And the view was that if the French army is going to go in that direction, then the German army is going to just roll through Belgium and is able to get them from the rear. And then they could put the French army out of commission. So then in early 1914, Germans, once they declared war on France and Russia, tried to put the Schlieffen Plan into action. But as we can see from Max Boot's fourth theme, that the best strategies, tactics, and technology do not provide an edge forever. And we're going to see this while continuing in the video about how they were eventually stopped and forced into a trench warfare. So we're at August 1914. Germans tried to put the Schlieffen Plan into action, and they almost succeeded, but not quite. So through August and early September, the Germans were able to essentially roll through Belgium and keep the combined, mainly French forces. But there was also assistance from the British to keep them kind of on their toes. And this happened all the way until early September when they got near the Marne, or just a little bit past the Marne River in France, hence the name First Battle of the Marne. And it was here that the Sixth French Army, and we're talking about huge numbers of troops here, well over 2 million people, and fought in this entire battle. We're talking about the French Battle of the Marne. Um, so these battles are just occurring like at an epic scale. Um, and in general, an army typically like characterizes 50,000 to 60,000 troops, but this one Sixth French Army had over 200,000, which was considered massively huge at that time and still is today. So even though Germany had this massive army, and a clear objective and offensive, we can see through Max Boot's third theme that even if a country, in this case Germany, knows how to harness that military power, it must effectively employ it, which it was not able to, because on September 5th, 1914, the Sixth French Army recognized a mistake in the First German Army made. And this also ties into Max Boot's second theme, that countries that take advantage of changes win and those that don't lose. So French Army and the British Expeditionary Force were able to see that there was this clear gap, and that Germany had exposed their right flank. So the front of the army tends to be like where you have the strongest forces and where you have your supply routes going back and forth. So if you can outflank an army, which is what the French strategy was, they could hit Germany at its weaker points. So by September 5th, First German Army recognized this, but it was just too late. So on September 6th, they were essentially being confronted by the Sixth French Army, and turning to meet them, they created an opening between them and the Second German Army. So the French and the British were able to take advantage of that to essentially put the Germans just out of their place, and stop them from advancing. And we can see these various French armies over here, assisted by the British Expeditionary Force. And Germans were forced to retreat. So they retreated past the Aisne River, and then so now we're getting into November at the end of the year 1914, and they had essentially entrenched themselves. They built these super deep trenches in northern France, and a little bit of western Belgium, and this was the first time that Germany had suffered their biggest defeat to date. And so once they had to retreat, they had to retrench, and this is where these trenches were getting dug. And this was very dynamic because you had armies moving fairly rapid over periods of weeks and months, and then once Germany retrenched, you pretty much have this position of being static for the next few years, and this is how we get to this famous trench warfare on the Western Front. And Germany ended up retrenching there until the end of World War One. And this was a pretty big deal, because the First Battle of the Marne, nickname is Miracle of the Marne, because the French, with the British help, were able to push the Germans back. And had they not done that, Germany could have potentially accomplished, or probably would have accomplished, the Schlieffen Plan, and actually could have won World War One as a long-term impact, or at least been able to win the Western Front very quickly, and had enough time to come back to Russia on the Eastern Front, to take them on. But because of the Miracle at the Marne, they were not able to do that, and this was a huge casualty of a war. So between the 2 million troops fighting, there was a total of 500,000 casualties between both sides, and that's about 100,000, 200,000 dead on each side. And because of that, the huge sacrifice that they had made, France and British Expeditionary Force were able to hold off Germany and essentially enter the Western Front into a multiple year long trench warfare.
So just to recap, wage a two-front war, which was ultimately unsuccessful because while they assumed that Russia would take many weeks, 6 weeks, to get their army together, and they would be able to decisively beat France, that was clearly not the case, as is in most battles. They were isolated by France, and then Russia was able to end up coming through. This kind of plays into Max Boot's first theme with technology alone does not always provide a military edge. Tactics, organization, training, leadership, and bureaucracy allow revolutions to take place. So France was able to use incredible leadership capabilities and teamwork skills in order to attack on the right flank and essentially encompass on all sides in order to stop Germany from invading further into France. Interesting fact, the German forces were actually really exhausted by the time they reached Paris and actually had to march over 150 miles, which was something I had no idea about, but thought was really cool. So overall impact of the battle, over 500,000 were killed or wounded, which was a huge number in this time period, as is across all history. While the German Schleifen plan failed to decisively defeat the Allied powers, they occupied a good portion of northern France and kept themselves in isolation. And this overall was a victory for Allied forces because Germany wasn't able to completely succeed and gain more territory. And we can see later on throughout history in World War I how there were more attacks on Germany in their position, in their trench position. So this was the first major battle where reconnaissance planes were used to discover out enemy military positions. And this kind of plays into Max Boot's fifth theme that innovations have increased more rapidly. So we see in the Prussian with Moltke Sr. That we're kind of looking at the telegraph and basic electronics and radio as new inventions of the time, but we have progressed as a whole into using reconnaissance planes and even taxis, which were called taxis in the Marne, became a symbol of France's will to win the war by utilizing these motor vehicles in order to move people across the different locations to effectively speed up the war. And ultimately this led to the first battle of the Aisne and the race to the sea, which followed the first battle of the Marne. Just to sum it up real quickly, both of these battles were Franco-British initiative, offensive, to encompass and envelope the German trench forces, and it was called the race to the sea because they moved in such a way, they maneuvered in such a way that they started to hit the edge of the Baltic Sea and try to attack Germany from that side. This was not really very effective and was indecisive in the end. And we can kind of see that right here as we hit towards the North Sea and come across over here. So do we have any questions?
Yeah, so do you feel that the German Schleifen plan made correct assumptions against Russia?
No, I don't believe that they did, because while they assumed that they would be able to take France quickly, that was clearly not the case. The battle took a lot longer than they thought. It was not decisive, and in that time, Russia's large army was able to attack from the eastern front, thus leaving Germany kind of in a pickle, vulnerable to attacks from both sides. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question. Why do you feel like it was a victory, like this battle was a victory for the Allied forces?
It was a victory for the Allied forces because Germany had major successes prior to World War I, and being able to stop them from coming into France and taking over more territory was huge, since they were a major player in the war. Ultimately, it resulted in a major loss for them, and overtaking in their government, which resulted in the collapse of the German government towards the end of 1918 when World War I actually ended.
I have a question.
Okay.
Why did you choose this topic?
I chose this topic because after watching 1917, the movie, which was about two young British soldiers who have to deliver a message to a commanding officer who is fighting the Germans on the Western Front. I saw this was actually one of the topics listed and thought that would be a pretty cool way to kind of learn more about what I had just watched. Yep. These are my resources. Thank you for listening.